Hello everyone, I'm Sonya Surabhi Gupta. In this series on acontecimientos contemporáneos, that is contemporary events, this video will focus on Operation Condor. So what was the Operation Condor or the Plan Condor? It was one of the darkest episodes in 20th century Latin American history that took place during the dictatorships in the 1970s and 1980s. So what we're going to try and do is understand how Operation Condor functioned and what were its consequences. And we will also try and see the efforts that were made towards securing justice for its victims after the countries involved in Operation Condor transitioned into democracies. I would like to underline once again that Operation Condor or Plan Condor was one of the most difficult episodes, the more darkest episodes of Latin American history, of our times. It took place in the 1970s and 1980s, which is the time that you will remember that many countries in Latin America were under dictatorships, and these dictatorships had come to power mainly through military coup d'etats. So the dictatorships of Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay and Uruguay, these 6 countries, they set up Operation Condor, which is also known as Plan Condor. This was a secret and covert transnational network of coordination to persecute, torture and eliminate political opponents, trade unionists, student activists, and they did it jointly across these 6 countries. It functioned secretly from the mid-1970s until the early 1980s, and it turned the entire South American region into a borderless area of terror and impunity. And because of its secret and clandestine nature, and also because investigations into the Operation Condor are still going on, it is difficult to arrive at a precise number of deaths directly attributable to Operation Condor. Some estimates are that at least 60,000 deaths can be attributed to Plan Condor, and roughly 30,000, just almost half of these in Argentina alone. And therefore, in order to understand the real nature of Operation Condor, we need to see a bit of historical background as to how these dictatorships came to power and what kind of thinking allowed such brutal torture and killing of so many people in a coordinated manner across countries, across borders. So the first thing we need to remember is that since the mid-1950s, the world had been divided by the Cold War. There was the Western Bloc, led by the United States, which waved the banner of liberalism, capitalism and free market. And across the ocean, Soviet Union promulgated socialism, Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc both. Since the mid-1950s, Latin America oscillated between the right and the left, sometimes in a very bloody way, as is the case of the coup d'etat, these suffered by many countries in the region, mainly against progressive governments. By the 1970s, the balance tipped towards these conservative dictatorships who took up the international struggle against communism, socialism or anything that vaguely resembled it. The practice of systematic annihilation of political enemies, political opponents in Latin America began as early as 1954 with the military coup in Guatemala against the elected government of Jacobo Arbenz. The moderate and liberal Arbenz government expropriated some 1.4 million acres of arable land, including huge properties of this US-owned company called United Fruit Company in Guatemala. This was a part of the huge agrarian reform which President Arbenz had embarked upon, and it is calculated that this agrarian reform benefited 500,000 Guatemalan peasants. In the 10th Inter-American Conference, convened in March 1954 in Caracas, US Secretary of State John Foster Dulles mobilized the delegates against the Arbenz government, alleging that it represented a communist threat to the Americas. And a few months later, in June 1954, the CIA engineered the overthrow of the Arbenz government through armed mercenaries. Subsequently, almost as though in a domino effect, military violence engulfed the entire South American region. So in Paraguay, you had Alfredo Stroessner, the dictator. This was in 1954. In Brazil, there was this dictator called Humberto de Alencar Castelo Branco in 1964. Bolivia, Hugo Banzer in 1979. Uruguay, Juan Maria Bordaberry, and then that was also in 1971. And Chile with Augusto Pinochet in 1973, and finally Argentina with Jorge Rafael Videla in 1976. All of them led extreme right-wing dictatorships that systematically violated human rights of their citizens for years, including torture, extrajudicial executions, enforced disappearances, illegal appropriation of children, and sexual violence. Latin American leftist governments were never good news for the United States. So the coming to power of the dictatorial right was hardly seen as a problem by the Western power. From the 1950s onwards, the United States government promoted the national security doctrine towards the objective of combating communism. Now, according to this doctrine, the countries of its bloc were made responsible for fighting the communist threat within their own borders with the financial and technical support of the Americans. Now, this national security doctrine was basically a military doctrine, and the doctrine valued national security or state security over individual freedoms. It originated in the US, but was adopted at different stages by Latin American armed forces from the 1960s onwards. And it was based on an idea developed by the American philosopher and political theorist James Burnham. You know, Burnham was the chair of philosophy department in the New York University. If you see his coordinates, he's born in 1905 and died in 1987. And in his book titled The Struggle for the World, which was published in 1947, he called for common citizenship between the United States, Great Britain, and the British dominions, as well as a world federation against communism. Burnham thought in terms of a hegemonic world instead of a balance of power. And I quote from his book. He says, "A world federation initiated and led by the United States would be, we have recognized, a world empire. In this imperial federation, the United States, with a monopoly of atomic weapons, would hold a preponderance of decisive material power over all the rest of the world. In world politics, that is to say, there would not be a balance of power." That's the end of the quote by James Burnham, and as I said, it is from this book titled The Struggle for the World, published in 1947. Now, Burnham actually saw Western civilization itself as being in danger. For him, the Cold War struggle was not about defending capitalism or democracy, but defending the Western civilization. According to him, West was becoming smaller, it was shrinking, it had lost its colonies, while communism was becoming bigger. It had advanced in China, in Cuba. He therefore advocated a national security doctrine that justified brutality in the interest of eradicating what he called leftist subversion. Now, the Latin American dictatorships also used the doctrine of national security to control various aspects of social life in the name of national defense and their fight against communism. The doctrine excused repression by dictatorships throughout Latin America from the mid-1960s, and by mid-1970s, human rights repression had also acquired an additional sinister transnational dimension. And Operation Condor that we are studying today was one such project inspired precisely by this national security doctrine that I have talked about. So, the objective of Operation Condor was to coordinate in order to persecute and eliminate leftist leaders who could mobilize the population against dictatorial regimes. And thanks to this agreement, which had been arrived at between the armed forces of these 6 countries, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay and Bolivia, the personnel of these armed forces could freely move across borders to persecute opponents. Declassified CIA documents have revealed that in the 1970s, even the United Kingdom, France and West Germany sought advice from South American dictatorships to implant an organization similar to Operation Condor in Europe to kind of combat what they thought was leftist subversion. So, how did this Operation Condor work? Condor initially emerged from informal kind of cooperation, bilateral forms of cooperation between armed forces, security forces of Argentina, Paraguay, Chile and Uruguay mainly from as early as 1972. But later it was officially created at a meeting of intelligence and security forces which was organized by DINA. DINA is the Chilean National Intelligence Directorate. It was the Chilean secret police, and this meeting was held in Santiago in Chile in November 1975. Around 50 officials from the dictatorships in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay and Uruguay participated in this meeting. It's only later declassified documents through which all this information has become available. And later on in 1976, Brazil formally kind of joined the Plan Condor, and in 1978, Peru and Ecuador also did so. So this alliance of criminal states, so to say, abducted, murdered or disappeared hundreds of individuals in a coordinated manner. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights defined the Operation Condor as, I'm quoting from their report, highly organized transnational coordination with constant training, advanced communication systems, intelligence centers and strategic planning, as well as a parallel system of clandestine prisons and torture centers. So this repressive coordination had different phases. The first phase was a centralized information database was created, on the guerrilla movements, parties and groups of the left, trade unionists, religious, liberal politicians, and the supposed enemies of authoritarian governments. And so, all these were, a database was created. Now, there was also close coordination and information exchange between police and armed forces of the 6 countries involved in the Operation Condor. The second phase was joint operations within South America across the borders of different countries. So those who were considered as political enemies at the regional level were identified and attacked. The third phase was targeted assassinations outside South America. So in fact, operations were carried out outside the region to find and eliminate people who were in other countries. So this transnational repressive coordination completely disregarded all principles of international law on refugees, for example, and the long custom of protecting exiles in South America. So exiles who would go to another country, escaping military dictatorships, escaping torture from their own country and thinking that they had found safe havens, became victims of death traps abroad. Plan Condor agents travel beyond South America also. For example, I'll give you the example of Chilean politician Bernardo Leighton and his wife, who survived an assassination attempt in Rome in October 1975. The former Chilean diplomat Orlando Letelier was killed with his assistant in September 1976 in Washington, D.C. Confronting past atrocities is essential to consolidate democracy and human rights protection. Truth and justice initiatives investigating crimes perpetrated at the national level have long been occurring. Yet, accountability for transitional crimes is a pending issue in scholarship and practice. I have quoted from a report filed by the European Commission project, which was held between 2016 and 2020, titled Operation Condor, Accountability for Transnational Crimes in Uruguay. It was particularly focusing in Uruguay. But it talks about how today one of the main concerns is accountability. How do these people who indulged in these kind of crimes, how can justice handle them? How can they be brought to book? In the 1980s and 1990s, when the process of democratization to put an end to these military governments that had proliferated in Latin America during the 20th century, that started happening. And the national security doctrine, which I have explained to you in detail, which was pushed by the United States and adopted throughout the Americas, also had to be abandoned because the ghost of communism could not any longer be used, to kind of confront enemies. And nearly 50 years on, accountability for the transnational crimes committed in the 1970s and 1980s by the coordinated Plan Condor remains a largely unresolved matter in South America. Now, though these transnational atrocities began to be investigated after democracy returned in South America, the problem was how to achieve accountability for transnational human rights violations. How could the justice systems of one country, individual countries, respond to these cross-border atrocities? For example, on May 27, 2016, for the first time ever, a court in Latin America ruled that Operation Condor was a supranational criminal conspiracy organized to disappear political opponents across borders. Now, this verdict was handed down by an Argentine court that convicted 14 high and mid-ranking Argentine military officers who acted during the 1976-1983 dictatorship and one Uruguayan military officer for their involvement in this criminal plan. The Operation Condor verdict in Argentina of 2016 broke new ground in human rights and transitional justice for its innovative focus on transnational crimes and for holding state agents accountable for extraterritorial human rights violations. So, this investigation, which began in 1999, was started by two lawyers, David Baigun and Alberto Pedronicini. They filed a legal complaint on behalf of 5 disappeared persons of different nationalities, but all of them victims of the Southern Cone dictatorships, repressive coordination under the Plan Condor during the 1970s. So, the main argument was that these disappearances were carried out in the framework of a conspiracy between the highest ranking military and political leaders making criminal use of state apparatus in a context of dictatorial regimes in the entire region. And this ruling, depended on mobilized hundreds of witnesses, some of whom were actually survivors of concentration camps or relatives of the disappeared. They were researchers, journalists, public officials, and their stories referred to a common thread of struggle, persecution, exile and death. Many testified via video conference from their countries of origin. So, in addition to people's testimonies, there were thousands of documents and archival materials that made it possible to explain the scope of the operation. For example, there were a dozen reports by human rights organizations, more than 400 dossiers from the CONADEP, which is the National Committee on the Disappearance of Persons in Argentina. There were various reports from international organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, thousands of declassified documents from the US State Department, Paraguay's Archive of Terror and the National Security Archive. This National Security Archive was of the Chilean National Commission on Truth and Reconciliation, the National Archive of Memory in Argentina, and the historical research on the detained disappeared conducted by the Presidency of Uruguay. Now, there were several reports also from the Rio de Janeiro State Truth Commission in Brazil and hundreds of documents from the armed forces and journalistic, historical and judicial investigation. So, we will see just one of the examples of these archival materials, and that is the Paraguayan Archives of Terror, which were found in December 22, 1992 by a lawyer and human rights activist called Dr. Martin Almada and a judge who was accompanying him. And where did they find them? In a police station in Asuncion, which is the capital of Paraguay. Now, Fernandez was looking for files on a former prisoner. But what did he find instead? He found archives describing the fates of thousands of Latin Americans who had secretly been kidnapped, tortured and killed by the security services of Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Paraguay and Chile in cooperation with the CIA in the Operation Condor. In fact, the terror archives have listed 50,000 people murdered, 30,000 people disappeared and 4 lakh people imprisoned. Portions of the archives, which are now in Asuncion's Palace of Justice, have been used in the judicial processes to prosecute former military officers. For example, the famous case of the Spanish judge Baltasar Garzon, he built his case against the Chilean dictator General Pinochet using these very archives. General Pinochet was arrested in October 1998 in London. So, to conclude, I would say that many Latin American human rights activists, family members of the victims of Operation Condor, are still fighting for justice. Their slogan is Nunca Más, meaning never again. I think we would all agree that never again should such crimes against humanity happen. Thank you.
Well, let's do the U.S. first. The United States in this period, the 1970s, was a major sponsor of the military dictatorships that had overthrown some democracies, some faltering civilian governments. Whatever it was, the result was governments like Videla, like Pinochet, like Banzer in Bolivia, who were killing their citizens with impunity. The United States knew about the mass killing. We had this kind of schizophrenic, Machiavellian attitude toward it. We really don't want these communists to be taking over governments, and we fear that democracy is leading to communist governments. Indeed, a leftist government led by Salvador Allende installed a democratically elected civilian and revolutionary government in Chile, and that's why Pinochet overthrew that government. The United States was deathly fearful that this would spread in Latin America, and so supported the coming of dictatorships. When they began mass killings, the United States was aware of these mass killings. When they learned of Condor shortly after it was created, there's no evidence that they knew about it the day it was created. The earliest evidence is a couple months after it began its operations. But they certainly knew these things were happening. And if you look at the meetings, the transcripts of the meetings between Henry Kissinger and these leaders, both in Argentina and in Chile, where we have the records, what do they say in private? You know, we support what you are doing. We understand that you have to assert your authority. Try your best to release some prisoners, because I'm under a lot of pressure in Congress, because the Democrats are trying to make me, defend human rights. Do the best you can, but I understand what you're doing. And in one case, 2 weeks after Kissinger visited Santiago, there was the second major meeting of all the Condor countries to discuss Condor. And at that meeting in June 1976, they approved operations for assassination outside of Latin America. The first assassination that occurred was in Washington, D.C. Orlando Letelier, the former foreign minister, was killed on the streets of Washington.
Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth report.